Okay, so thank you, Professor Angela O'Sullivan, for coming along to do a talk on a topic that's very relevant at the moment on inclusivity. Professor Angela O'Sullivan is from the Montfort University, and the title of Angela's talk is Understanding Inclusivity, Are We Trying Too Hard? Angela champions inclusivity as a professor of inclusive practice in teaching and learning, as I said, at the Montfort University. And it's over to you, Angela.
Thank you. It's lovely to see everybody here tonight. I've just had this all set up as sharing the screen, and now I've realised that when I accepted that the recording was there, I can't move the thing to let me go into to present. I can't get my screen there to be able to start the presentation from the as in a slideshow, if you see what I mean. So apologies if I present it like this. It was all looking good, and now it all seems to have gone. Unless anybody can tell me how I can remove the black bar at the top, which is stopping me from being able to click on presenting, if you understand what I mean.
The black bar. Go ahead, James.
Sorry, I was just going to say, you should, it may just be a window that you can move, but if not, you can also do the little one at the bottom down there, the projector screen. Can you get to that one, bottom right? All the way to the right. And now a little to the left, just to the right, two more.
That one.
That one.
Yeah.
Oh, there we are. You see,
nice.
That's everybody working together. Thank you. Inclusive practice in action. Thank you. Yeah. So I'm a professor of inclusive practice in teaching and learning, which sounds very, very specific, but actually is a very, very broad thing. So initially my interests were in widening participation, and in 2009 I became faculty head of widening participation for the Faculty of Health and Life Sciences at Montfort University. And that very much involved the whole student journey from outreach, transitions, everything that happened as everybody progressed through their courses and on into employability. So quite an interesting role. And along the way, I became a teacher fellow at Montfort University, and that's something that's related to teaching excellence and supporting colleagues and students. And that led me on a journey to then become a national teacher fellow, obviously now part of the International Federation. But I'm also led a CATE project, Advanced HE CATE project, which is an outreach project. It's called Crash Ed, and it is another inclusive thing, really, where it's trying to develop outreach in an inclusive way from in an interdisciplinary perspective. So all of these different things that I was doing all sort of came together. I've taught in FE, I've taught HE in FE, HE itself in lots of different areas. I teach science, but mainly anatomy and physiology in a range of different programs. And I've also taught science in a prison. So all sorts of areas that made me think about science and think about teaching and learning from lots of different perspectives. So it's a very holistic sort of presentation that I'm giving to you. And it very much is underpinned by a humanist approach, which is really how I see inclusivity, as being very humanist. I'm going to give you some humanist examples to see, to talk through, and also at the end maybe to expand on. So that's me, and so I'm based at Montfort University in Leicester. If we're talking about inclusion and we go straight to the etymology of the word, the strangest thing is that it literally means shut in, and yet that's a very negative thing. And we know that negative terminology is something that we ought to avoid, and yet we use inclusion as a very positive thing. So that's kind of one of the tags that I've got on, are we trying too hard? Because if we fully are inclusive, have we got everybody all together? And indeed, is that where everybody wants to be, shut in all together? So that's the kind of line that I'm taking to draw us into a bit of discussion about it. Now, Breton did a really interesting perception of how groups are in constructs of society, not necessarily to do with relating to education even, but I find this quite interesting in terms of what we consider, how we can relate this into our educational environment. So A is exclusion, where some people can't get in. And so if we were to think about maybe an exam room, this is how we used to be a long time ago, when there was a lot of big rooms that were inaccessible for some people, particularly people who might have a disability. And so they are literally excluded. And what did we do about that? Well, we decided we were going to have a different room for them, and they would take their exams somewhere else. And so that becomes B, segregation, where those that can't access are accommodated elsewhere. But there's all sorts of reasons why that might not be the best thing to do. And in all honesty, there may well be somebody who's in that group, which is the main group in the main exam hall, who would feel much better being in that smaller segregated group. But it's kind of what we moved into doing, isn't it? Is that a lot of us thought, oh, you know, we tend to call them sheltered places for exams. Then we've got C, which is integration. So let's bring them in. But often with integration, what we're doing is we're bringing them in, but actually we're still separating them. So we're saying, right, you're here, you might be a student who has, for example, extra time. So all of those who are having extra time, you go and sit in that corner, or you go and sit in the first few rows. And again, really what we're doing is we're integrating them, but we're still separating them. So, and one thing that I find particularly frustrating is that maybe then we're also labeling them and we're identifying them when they might not want that, because that definitely isn't something that's very inclusive. So then if we look at D, then everybody's in together, and that's the definition here. That's Breton's definition of inclusion. Everybody's there together. But I kind of challenge whether that is the best way for us to be in education, because going back to the definition of being enclosed, then actually we are all together, but we're all in the same place. And there may still be people who want to be somewhere else. But what we've done is we've taken exclusion through segregation, integration, to get to what we're calling maybe pure inclusion. But is that necessarily what we want? So I thought about this a lot, and I've kind of made it my own little model using the same icons that were in the previous one, that actually this is what I call my open field model. So we've got the sort of medieval fields with the ridge and furrow, where people actually had different pieces of ground that they farmed, but we didn't have the defined fences or hedges that we've got now. But everybody knew what was their bit and didn't go wandering off and start farming on somebody else's. But literally, for me, this model is that it's like, I mean, I'm a biologist, so I see this as a semi-permeable membrane. So this is a bit like osmosis and things, that things can come in or go out. So people can know where the central place is, the university, for example, or college, but they can go out of that, or they can come into that as they want to. And the constructs of there being everybody included with a barrier which we've managed to get everybody into just doesn't exist anymore. So funnily enough, whilst I was starting to think about this model, we obviously got into the pandemic situation, and that meant that this does sort of emulate what we're talking about blended learning or hybrid learning, where you can either be there or you can be outside, or it can be your choice. So that's, to me, I feel as though this probably is the perfect inclusion, even though people are not necessarily in there, if that makes sense. So now that we've released the boundaries, because literally I felt that's what they were, is that we tried to be inclusive, but we've actually put barriers there. And then if we take them away and say that they're open barriers, then maybe what do we need to do to improve inclusivity if we've at least got that far along the line? And obviously people might not agree that the open field model is a better way of being inclusive. Now, I said I'm a bit of a humanist, so I'm going to look at things from a humanist approach. And I'm going to talk about parking machines, which everybody has got something to say about parking machines, I've found. So I'm giving everybody a parking ticket so you can park for the whole webinar, depending, you know, from 23rd to the 24th, depending on what time zone you're in. We're here, we've got our parking machine ticket. But how did we get it? And what you may not have realised is that in parking machines, there's tremendous diversity. And you might wonder why it is that I spend my life going around taking pictures of parking machines. But one of the reasons is that on a lot of these, you'll see it says that it's out of action. And I don't trust them at all, parking machines. So my attitude is, okay, you're going to tell me that you're not working, and I'm going to photograph you with the time and date, hopefully, and it's going to be my evidence when the ticket arrives that actually I couldn't use this parking machine. But the thing about it is, the strange thing about parking machines is that they're all trying to do the same thing for us. They're all trying to give us that ticket that says we're okay, we can park. Now, I know we don't all drive, but so I might be giving an example that's not that inclusive. But even if you don't drive, you may well have been a passenger in a vehicle. And even if you've never used a parking machine in your life, you've probably seen them sneaking around on the sides of the roads. And so it's a sort of a familiar thing, but they're all trying to do the same thing, but they're all doing it in slightly different ways. And so I liken parking machines a little bit to assessments, because at the end of the day, the outcome is always the same, hopefully, that you get the parking ticket to put in your car, not the parking ticket that means you've got to pay the fine. But they're all doing it in very different ways. So when you come along and meet one of them, it's giving you instructions. Some of them are saying this is a cashless machine. That looks as though it's an addition. We've gone from having cash, no, we don't have cash. Some of them you can pay by card, you can pay by cash. Some of them you can just scan nowadays, all sorts of different things about them. But when we look at them, these are all very different. These are all parking machines that I can find within about 10 miles of my house, but they're incredibly different. And if you look online and you look at, I know we've got lots of international representatives here. If, you know, you may well be thinking, oh no, the parking machines in my country are red or green. So we've got that vision in our mind. And when we come along to meet the parking machine, we then have to try and work out what instructions it's giving to us. I always seem to want to put the money in the wrong place. It never seems natural to me where I'm going to do that. So I'm often found trying to put money in where the card your pay card goes in or something. I often read the instructions in the wrong order because they're very random as to how they give you the instructions. Some of them want your registration number. I'm okay with that because I've got almost like a photographic memory for registration numbers. I'm fine with that. I see a lot of people having to walk off back to their car, take a picture of their registration number or memorize it or write it down, because it's not a natural thing, and particularly if it's a hire car or something, it's not your vehicle. So all of this information is information that we've got to put into this machine for the machine to then give us what we want. They always make me feel a bit stressed, and that's why I also feel they're a bit like assessments, because people tend to get a bit stressed about assessments. And I think the main reason that people get stressed about assessments is that they're worried they're going to fail. And when I meet a parking machine, I'm worried I'm going to fail, and it's going to be an expensive fail. So as we look at some of these, we can see that there's things about them where they've really thought about the parking machine and how it's going to help different people. So I think some of the best ones that I'd observed were ones where the keypads are quite low down, so wheelchair users are able to access them. So people have thought about whether people can access according to whether they're particularly tall or whether they're short or whether they're a wheelchair user. So we can see examples of that here. So to me personally, there you can see me, reflection of me taking another picture of a parking machine that's not in use. So this is the sort of one that I actually think, well, I used to think this was a very inclusive parking machine. It's not in use at the moment in the picture, but it does give quite good instructions. Number one, press the key, and you know, it comes up with a message then telling you what to do. You have to put your registration number in the keypad in the middle, and then if you're paying by card, you have to put your PIN number in the right hand side. So I came across one of these in a hospital car park, and I was thinking, right, that's an inclusive parking machine. Somebody has designed this because they're thinking about the users, and they're making it into, you know, quite a logical progression. The sort of things we know, like green is okay and red seems to be, oh no, I want to get my money back. These are little signals that we tend to pick up. But in February last year, myself and my ankle had a little bit of a mishap, and I ended up on crutches for 4 months. And at the hospital car park, which this isn't the actual one, but it was like this, I arrived at the machine, and I was on my crutches, and I thought, well, how difficult can this be? You know, I'm not going to say I'm an expert of car park machines, but I've met a lot of them. So I thought, I'm going to deal with this. But actually, it was nowhere near as easy as I expected, because I couldn't reach down to those buttons on my crutches. And yet this machine had been designed inclusively. You can see that it had been. So I had to put the crutches down. I literally had to sit on the tarmac to be able to press those buttons. And yeah, I did look a little bit grumpy, I think, doing that. But worse than that, it was pitch dark. I'm at the hospital car park, it's dark. And you might say, well, there was backlights. There was no backlights on these buttons. And I'm there struggling away, sitting on the tarmac, trying to work this out. And whilst I was fumbling around, I found the help button. And was I pleased to find that? So I pressed that, and I explained the whole situation. I'd put money into the machine. I wasn't sure if I'd put the right registration number in because I couldn't see any of the things. And I got a really nice person at the other side who said to me, don't worry about it. You have actually paid. And if you don't get out the car park soon, you'll have to pay again. I'm thinking, what? Okay, pick up my crutches, get out as fast as I can. So, you know, quite a traumatic experience for me with the parking machine. So what have we learned? What have I learned from that? Well, by trying hard to be inclusive, we can actually make things more difficult for others, because I totally agree about having the buttons low for people to be able to access. But when you're on crutches, that isn't something you can do. And it took me a long time to learn how to use them. But being able to do that was never something that I would easily be able to do, because they were so low down. And we need to listen to everyone's perspective when we design things, because if you did a big enough spread, particularly in a hospital car park, you're going to find somebody who's on crutches, and they're going to tell you this is pretty difficult. But also, we always need to have support on hand. So that support was there 24/7, day and night. And I don't think I'm the only person that that lovely gentleman has helped out of a mess. So, you know, this evaluation, if all of this had been done before the machine was put there, then I wouldn't have ended up in that mess. Now, what was I doing at the hospital anyway? So could I have been getting my ankle x-rayed? Could I have been seeing an orthopedic specialist? So because I told you I had hurt my ankle, because I told you I was at the hospital, it's quite likely that you might have thought that it was something to do with my ankle, but actually no. I was supporting a neighbour who'd got an appointment at the hospital. And so the next place that your mind might go might be, well, why didn't I get them to help me with the car park machine? Why was I sitting on the ground in the dark trying to do all of this? Well, they had an ophthalmology appointment. And my neighbour could bend down to the parking machine absolutely perfectly, but she couldn't see anything because she just had these drops in her eyes. So between us, we had the right skills, but we couldn't utilise them together. So again, this is about looking at things with an open mind, because when you consider all the possibilities of, you know, what the problem might be for the user, then you are actually in that situation of thinking that maybe you know, we thought we'd got this sorted in our heads, but actually we were wrong. There was more to this than we thought. So this is where it comes into unconscious bias, because being honest, did you assume that I was at the hospital because of my ankle? Now, you may not have actually thought about that at the time, but unconscious bias probably took you there because I'd kind of given you a few lead markers to make you think, yes, she's hurt her ankle, she's at the hospital. And unconscious bias is a really dangerous thing. We often think we are trying hard to be inclusive, when what we're actually doing is making assumptions because of unconscious bias. So most people will make the assumption that I was at the hospital because of my injury. In fact, everybody I told the saga to, you know, all the hassle that I had, it actually took me a long time to sort the problem out. I know it seems a small thing, but it delayed me by quite a long time, the car parking machine. So everybody I mentioned it to said, oh, were you there because of your ankle? And no, I wasn't. So why are you making that assumption? And why don't you just ask me why I was there and become aware of the perspective and hear the full story? And often we don't do that. We don't listen to the full story. We look at a situation. I think we identify what we think is the inclusive issue, and then we address it. And then we don't necessarily think outside of that box. So we're not open-minded, we're quite narrow. I'm making it easier for this person, and haven't I done a good job about that? So that's what I mean by, are we trying too hard? Are we trying too hard to focus on one group to include them at the expense of excluding or making things more difficult for others? Now, here's other examples that I've heard. Actually, I've heard these said to people. I know you're an atheist, so I made sure you're not sitting next to anyone religious. Okay. I know you're a vegan, so I made sure there's at least one thing on the menu that you can eat. Okay. So depending on your own perspective, you will take those sentences differently, because you may be an atheist or a vegan, or you may not. You may know somebody who is in those categories, or you may not. And so it might be a powerful sentence that really makes you think, I don't like that sentence, or it may be a sentence that kind of wafts past you and you're not particularly engaged with it. But if we look at the answers, jumping to the wrong conclusion can actually make something exclusive be inclusive, be exclusive. So the person who is the atheist, and this person has decided that they're not going to sit them with all of the religious people because they think that's the inappropriate thing. The most important thing to that person was, I would have preferred to sit at that table because it's near the door. So that person might have an anxiety issue. And the most important thing to them is that they're sitting near the door, not who they're sitting with. But what unconscious bias does is it makes you make the decision for them. So we've got one dish on the menu for the vegan. I don't like the one vegan dish on the menu. So making a choice for somebody, including them by saying, yeah, there's a vegan option there, but if they don't like it, then actually we're excluding them. And the thing that comes to the bottom of all of these kind of things is, why didn't you ask me? Why didn't you say, you know, what do you eat, or where would you like to sit? And these kind of things can be really important, particularly for students who have anxiety issues. Where they sit in a lecture theatre or in a seminar group with tables can be really, really important. And we don't know what that issue is. We don't know that they might feel anxious and want to be near the door. We don't know if they might feel that they always feel better near a window. We don't know. But when we're very prescriptive about what's happening in the educational learning environment, we take away that option from them. So it's like putting the inclusive barrier around without the open field model, which allows them to do what they want to do. I think the most important thing about inclusivity is us. We are in the middle of inclusivity. We are absolutely central to understanding diversity. So don't be afraid of making mistakes, because that's how we naturally learn. That's how a child learns, isn't it? By making mistakes. And we're going to make mistakes whilst we're trying to be inclusive, because we're not going to always know the perspective of the other person. You don't realise it until maybe you're in that situation or somebody explains it to you. So if we focus too much on one element, we can make things less inclusive for others, as we've seen in the different examples I've talked about. So we need to learn. We need to learn about the needs of others to be more inclusive. And there's all sorts of CPD out there. I went on a really interesting training course with the National Carers Federation. And what they explained was that if if a student is a young carer, for example, they have all of these different tasks that they need to do, like they need to make an appointment for the person they're caring for. They need to go and pick up a prescription, but the chemist closes at such and such a time. And when you layer that on top of, I've got to be at my lecture, or I've got this deadline for an assessment that clashes with the person's hospital appointment, you start to see how complex it is. So I think CPD is really important. Around inclusivity, lots of subgroups. There's lots of training there where we can understand subgroups that we wouldn't necessarily know. Commuter students are another interesting one. You hear students who have to set off at 6 o'clock in the morning to get to a 9 o'clock lecture. And that's because, you know, particularly where they live or the connections of the transport they're using means that it becomes a really long ordeal for them. Obviously, people with caring responsibilities, children, we can see all these different layers, but often we don't see it fully until we're there. So that's why we either have to listen to people, ask the questions, what is your barrier to learning? Why is it you're always arriving late? Understand that, and then try and address it through not necessarily maybe timetable changes, maybe moving people into different seminars. But actually, if one person is having a problem, you may well find that a lot of students have got the same problem, but they're not speaking up. And we're never going to know unless we actually ask. So the other thing is, do people want to be included? Because it very much depends on their perspectives. And also, somebody's views might change with the context that they're in. So we need lots of choices. So we're not in a situation where what we're saying is, I've just arrived at university and this is what I want to do. These are the choices I want. This is how I want the planning of the course to be for me from a personal perspective. Because 6 months later, that might be different. Their own personal circumstances might change, and we need to be flexible to that. So what you see is what you get. And we can look at something. This is just a sketch, and we'll look at it, and we actually all will perceive that differently. So it's not clearly anything, but sometimes when we set assessments, we know what we mean because we set it. But when somebody else is looking at it, they might look at it from a different perspective, and they might not fully understand what we were getting at when we designed it. So let's make a little change to it. Let's make it pink and yellow, and a green thing that maybe looks a bit like a plant, and maybe now a person. So we can have a pink and yellow parasol. So we might now be thinking of somebody who's on a beach or an island, next to a swimming pool. Suddenly, just by giving it a bit of colour, gives us a bit of inclusive context. We still don't really know what's going on. They run up the steps. Are they waving in joy, or actually, you know, are they waving around because there's something wrong? We can all jump straight away to what we perceive as being what that's about. And actually, some people will see things completely differently. So some people will turn that on its head, and they're now seeing a boat, and the thing that was green and looked like a plant is now yellow and could be the sun. The things that look like steps have now become like a flag. And our person in the boat, are they having the time of their life, or are they waving frantically, you know, person overboard or something? We don't know. But what this shows us is that the same sketch, which is like the framework for an assessment, will be filled in with the unconscious bias of our student. And we need to acknowledge that it happens and acknowledge that they can perceive things in a completely different way. So the only way we're going to understand their potential misconception is to listen to them and get feedback, or we get our students very involved from the beginning. So as co-creators, they are taking the black and white framework there, and they're helping us fill in where the assessment is going to go. Or potentially the assessment can be very, very different. It can be like somebody sunning themselves under the parasol or somebody going around in the boat. It's the same assessment, and we're allowing students to have that flexibility to look at it in different ways. Now we'll look at some examples of that a bit later. So moving into the sort of real theory of universal design for learning, the Centre for Applied Special Technology in Harvard School of Graduate Education came up with these guidelines of UDL, which is basically flexible ways of learning, flexible resources, and flexible ways of demonstrating understanding. So that's the doing the assessment, flexible ways of being assessed. So the actual engagement, the thing that the student is engaging with, needs to be purposeful and it needs to be motivated. And that works quite well for vocational courses. It can be harder for non-vocational courses. And then lots of ways of representing what it is that you're trying to teach. And then different means of trying to assess it. Like we've just said, you can assess in different ways. So universal design for learning, there's quick start ideas for it, in that making learning, what happened in 2015 in DMU was that UDL was embedded across the whole university, first of all for level 1 and then gradually for all students. So making the resources available on the VLE at least 48 hours before the session and in a modifiable format, because it's like saying it's there, like the picture that we just had, but if you want to change it round, then you can. If you want bigger font or if you want a different coloured font, then you do that, because that helps you to be able to relate to it. Emphasising active learning and knowledge checks during all teaching sessions. So not just having a long period of time before making sure that at least a formative assessment has taken place. And signposting opportunities for self-directed study, so that if somebody is in the session and they're not necessarily liking that way of learning, then it's much more inclusive to say to them, look, there's other things here. You might want to watch this video, or, we might not be able to do all of this in this hour session, but here's other ways that different types of learners can follow the way. And also allowing learners to replay, review, or revisit. So sessions become either recorded or they become like narrated PowerPoints or a transcript, or whatever, or all of those things. And at first you might think that's quite time consuming, but actually the time that you don't spend dealing with students who've misunderstood is actually spent into putting these resources in place. And then flexible and inclusive methods of formative and summative authentic assessment, so that the motivation is kept there, because the student can see why they're doing that assessment, because it's more real and more authentic. So in terms of CPD at DMU, what we did was had a lot of sessions where people were given the opportunity to see how they could do 360-degree engagement, either by watching peers or with resources that had been put together, so that you could see all of the different things that you could do, from group discussion, reflective work, to peer teaching, all of the different ways that you can get students to engage. And that's a bit like saying, right, okay, there's loads of ways you could look at my picture of, is it a boat, is it an island or a pier or something, but some of us will find it easier to relate to one of those. And so this is the way of having the different ways of engaging. And then in the same way, different ways of representing it. So it could be tables, figures, pictures. We're all different types of learners. And again, uploaded 48 hours in advance meant that learners are able to, if they want to print it off, they've got time. If they want to modify it, they can. If they want to read it, they can, but they don't have to, because the session is going to take place anyway, and it's going to be recorded in some way. And then lots of ways of assessing, and assessing in fun ways with flexible formative assessments, not making the assessment a puzzle, not making it into a parking machine that you're not sure about it. You know, do I press this? Do I push that? Where do I put the card? Where do I put the money? Formative assessments put us in that inclusive place that we know what to expect. And then self-assessments so people can check how they're getting on. Lots of summative assessments in different ways, so that the ideal situation is that somebody could choose, do you want to do this by an essay, or do you want to do this by a presentation or a poster? And I know that brings in lots of problems that you might think, right, that's going to make moderation difficult, and that's going to make it difficult because you're actually analysing different things. But the bottom line of that is that if we're truly moderating properly, and if each assessment is properly aligned to outcomes, then it shouldn't actually be that difficult, because we're seeing what the marking descriptors are for the different types of assessments. And actually it can be a bit of a pleasure, instead of having 250 exam scripts where everybody's written the same thing back to you in an essay. Some people have done that, some people have done something else, which obviously has been agreed, but it means that even as a marker, it's not quite so overwhelming. So I tend to liken assessments as a little bit being like a gift. And when we don't know what to buy someone, it's, you know, you spend a little bit of time thinking about it, and then, I know, we'll get them a gift card, because then they can go and do what they want with it, can't they? And yet what we tend to do with assessments, I think, and I say we, I think it's higher education as a whole. I think a lot of people do tend to think, well, there's the good old standard assessment that we can always fall back on if we can't think of something more creative. And there might be different things in different subject areas. In some subject areas, it's very much MCQs, it's very much an essay. But actually, by always falling back on that standard thing, we're giving them a gift card, because although they're not having a choice, they're sort of taking it and thinking, oh, thanks, because nobody's really thought about them. Whereas if you know somebody, you might think, okay, I know they really like flowers, and here's some lovely tulips, and I'm going to buy them some tulips. You might know that somebody loves tortoises, and you might think, yeah, they love tortoises. So let's give them what we think they want. We know a little bit about them. Let's give them what we think they want. But in actual fact, what if the person who loves tulips suffers from hay fever? And giving somebody a tortoise, that one's about 2 years old, is a bit of a 50-year commitment. You know, it may be that they had a little fad that they like tortoises, you know, 1 year, but actually, what am I going to do with this? This isn't, you know, a tortoise is for life, not just for Christmas. So what we're saying is we know something about them, but really, do we know enough to make a judgment about what we give them? But if we listen to them and find out that they suffer from hay fever, that they like tortoises, but actually I don't want one, thank you very much, then we can come up with a completely different gift. We can give them a painting of flowers that's not going to make them sneeze. We can give them a little model tortoise, which if they get bored of, they can actually send it off to the charity shop if they want to, or gift it on. So what we're doing is we're saying, I know something about you, and I don't just know that you like flowers and tortoises. I know more about you. I know that you have hay fever, or you don't live in a situation where you want a commitment for a pet. And that's when you start to give somebody a gift that shows that you know a lot about them, they start to feel a sense of belonging. And I think this is part of inclusivity, that if you want to feel as though you belong, then people need to know about you, not just that maybe you're a vegan and therefore they put that on the menu for you, but they know more than that. You're a vegan, but you don't eat spinach. So what we're doing is we're finding out more, and people feel as though you care, and people feel as though they belong. And the only way we found that out was to listen. The same old thing about everything I've talked about tonight. It's listening to know what the problem is as to why the person is finding it difficult. So I think inclusive teaching, learning and assessment everyone needs to feel as though they belong. I think that is the most important thing, because that's like going back to the models about, do you actually want to be in this enclosed, inclusive space? And I think realism helps people. It gives them something that they can relate to. So the more real and authentic our teaching and our assessment, then people find something that they can latch onto. They can make their own decisions about how to learn and how to be assessed. And I know that's an ideal world and it might not be what you're used to, but the more we do that, the more we're not giving them a very narrow menu, the more we're giving them lots of opportunities. And we move away from something called forced participation, a phrase that Hodgkinson has created there, which not something that's been written a while ago now, but actually inclusivity is something we kept trying to crack this nut. But in this article, they mentioned this phrase forced participation, which I really can relate to, because I think forced participation is like that circle that we've got everybody into. We're making you all come into this now. That's what we're calling inclusion. You're all in and be happy for it. But actually, someone can work alone and be good at working alone and be praised for it, rather than being helped to overcome their shyness. If you look up shyness, if you do a little Google search for shyness, most of it comes up with telling you how to overcome it. We're seeing it as a negative thing. Shyness is something that we need to get out of people, and you need to be there, chatting away, and we're all different. And some people are shy and they like being shy, and it's one of their best qualities. So I think some things we need to do is we need to really recognize that there are people who don't want to be in with the in crowd. There are people who want to be outside of that, and they can still learn in that way, and they can still bring a lot to us. So I think those are my sort of key thoughts about inclusivity. One of the things that has happened over the time that we've been in lockdown is a lot of my work is focused on outreach activities and bringing young people into interdisciplinary situations. And obviously the problem with that, with the lockdown, was that was just not happening, and it still hasn't happened. But at DMU, we've got lots of resources that we have developed into this realistic, inclusive environment. And this is our crime scene house. So one of the things about this is that we have 360 filmed the crime scene house. And this is for an outreach project called In the Frame, which I put the links to it at the end of the presentation. So hopefully you'll be able to access them, and Martina hopefully will be able to share them for you. So if we have a look around the crime scene house, you can click on different things and find out bits of information. So for example, if we click on the newspaper, here's the Leicester Mercury, which is the local newspaper to me. There's somebody, Jamie Vardy from Leicester City Football Club. But we've also got, this is a piece of architecture, an old ruin that's near our campus. We've got a painting. Somebody might want to learn through painting rather than learning through reading and the newspaper. And then we've got portals that take us to different places. So here we are in the labs, and you can look around the lab, and everywhere where you can see something, there's either a portal to somewhere else or there's information. And here we've got our scanning electron microscope, which enables you to look at things like hair and boost it up so that you can see, what it looks like. So different types of hair, like the hair that you get from a cat is different to the hair that you get from a dog. Now, what we discovered, and there's a number of people who I acknowledge at the end of this presentation who helped with this, is that what we're doing is we're taking people into this environment. So it's inclusive. This is all done through something called SeekBeak. And this technology enabled us to put people in this situation without them being in this situation. And we have a lot of students who are very interested in science, but actually feel very nervous in laboratories. But this is an inclusive way of doing that. And the outreach activity is called In the Frame, and it's about an art forgery, or is it an art forgery? So there's a bit of a mystery there, and it includes reading. So some people might want to access the information through reading that newspaper. It involves science, so you might want to look at it from this perspective, from looking at pure science, and there's a lot of sort of sociology there as well. So bits of information lying around that enable you to piece the puzzle together. So this one, as I say, is called In the Frame, and hopefully you'll be able to access it and move around all of this yourself in your own time. The other one is called The Strawberry Thief, and this is an activity outside Leicester Museum and Art Gallery. And again, originally we'd intended this was going to be an on-the-street activity for a festival of arts that we were doing, Festival of Teaching. And there's a walkway which has been there since Victorian times, that called New Walk, that goes alongside this museum. And the idea was that we were going to be outside here, letting people learn how they wanted to, adults and children alike. But actually, when that couldn't happen because of lockdown, we filmed it. And then all different things are here. We called it the Strawberry Thief, after the William Morris Strawberry Thief pattern, which there's a lot of things linked to that in the museum. There was a list there of things that you can find. So you can scan around and then you can find, here's some hair. And we've already, in the other one, we've seen how the scanning electron microscope works. Here you can see that that's cat hair, dog hair. Here's an insect trapped in amber. So it encourages people to go and look in the museum, because there's artifacts in the museum. Here's a peacock feather, fell off somebody's hat in a bit of a forensic mystery. A little bit about the museum. So it's interdisciplinary. People can learn about the history. Some people, might not be interested in things like the feather, but other people might be very interested in the forensics. There's the answer sheet there, so eventually you hit on that, and there's also a feedback questionnaire. So I'm going to give you the links to the feedback for this, so as well as feedbacking to this session, if you want to go into these activities, we'd be really pleased if you were able to submit your comments to this, because this is a whole new inclusivity that we're moving into in outreach, where what we're trying to do is to let people learn what courses they might even want to go onto by being wherever they want, not being held within barriers, but actually being able to wander where they want, into the labs, around the crime scene house, outside the museum, learning as they go in the modes that they want to learn in. So my colleagues, Dr. Rachel Armitage, Lisa Nichols-Drew and Julia Reeve, we've collaborated together. We're very different in our backgrounds. Rachel is the scanning electron microscope technician at DMU. Lisa Nichols-Drew is a forensic science lecturer. And Julia Reeve is very into playful learning and things like Lego and really interactive activities. So the four of us are very different, but we've created a very collaborative and inclusive project. So as I say, hopefully you can link onto those and see much more. I've just given you a snapshot of those activities. So that pretty much is what I wanted to share with you, and thank you for listening. And I wonder if anybody has any questions, or whether, Martina, if you wanted to facilitate that.
Yes, that's great. Thank you for the talk. I'll just stop the recording.